right, it is nice and sunny. I know we said we'd try and be in the same place each time for this, and we will, but I'm currently at the National Aquarium. Couldn't really resist. It's too nice a day to not be outside, so I'm sat in a nice cafe just opposite the aquarium.
And I am in my new office. I'm all excited. This is my brand new office. So yeah, it's nice and quiet for now.
Well, if we get any interruptions, I'm sure it'll just add to it. So maybe we should just get people up to speed on what we've said we're going to try and do. We've said we'll try and do a weekly podcast. Um, I think with Morgan and Todd, it should be ladies first. My mother will be mad if it isn't. And we could stick with the same title. We could stick with approaching the whiteboard, but we'll just pick a topic each week and we'll kind of talk through it. That's the plan, eh?
Yeah, normally we talk about anything and everything anyways, so this is just recording those very frank conversations.
Inflicting it on the rest of the world, I think, is probably more
Exactly.
apt. So we said we talk about intervention, loosely around the idea of wave one, wave two, wave three. The things that I've been thinking about it recently are about when it begins, first of all. It seems a bit sort of pessimistic to begin it in term one, like day one. Equally, that's lost time, isn't it? If you know that if you've got data that supports a judgment. And then I've been thinking a lot about the volume of students. So how many students can you reasonably say should be part of a wave two or a wave three intervention? Should they be the same students? We often conflate performance and learning, which we know. And so flexible groupings, as suggested by the EEF on their inclusion document. Well, if it's flexible, when are we making those judgments and how? So that's kind of me laying out everything I've been thinking at the moment. What's
I
your
think
kind
I
of
have
thoughts on
like
intervention?
I have like some immediate thoughts to your points. The first one is that, like, of course, if you have data, you should begin as soon as possible. And that's just because it's always a cycle. So you will have like the previous year's data, and you should actually be planning out interventions that you are going to start in September the previous year. So you should have already had identified groups. It should be part of your department's action plans so that you're ready to go. Every single day is lost time because we do have data on those students. And even in admissions, we have intake data. If you were doing something like sixth form, we usually have in sixth form students take an A-level subject test
Yeah.
upon entry. So that we have some detailed data, not just a CAT-4 score, a cognitive ability score. That's so generalized that it's basically meaningless when it comes to their prior knowledge. So definitely, you should start off the year feeling really confident that you know who you can target right from the beginning. The second thing is, well, type two, type three, it really depends on prioritizing. You can't help everyone all at once, all the time. So you can start off the beginning of the year with targeted intervention. And then after that, because teachers are naturally always time poor, school structures are time poor, it really is about prioritizing and saying, okay, are we looking at students that are 2 levels below their target grades? Are we looking at students 1 level below their target grade? So um, again, you have to prioritize. It could be certain groups that you know from your school improvement plan need attention. But those are really complex questions to ask around a table. And it can be subject specific or it can be school specific, those groups that you're targeting with intervention. So it's such a broad, huge topic that tackling it kind of feels like you're eating around the corners of it, as opposed to just like diving right in. And sometimes
So,
you have to build structures first.
yeah, and so I suppose I'm sort of thinking about it initially because that's my current role as a subject leader. But as I start to think about it on scale, the more I'm thinking, how many of these kids are going to be repeats, students? It's going to be, oh, so I'm in intervention for English, math, science. I'm in intervention for PE. Oh my God, I'm in intervention for PE. Like, what does that actually do to a young person? Because to what extent are our judgments, first of all, accurate? And then second of all, when that student's in his 5 or 6 interventions, and he's going in school every day going, oh yeah, I got my intervention group later, got my intervention group later. What's the negative impact of that on his or her confidence around school compared to the benefit of the actual intervention? I would question intervention at all. And in fact, one of my teachers, when we were discussing it the other day, one of the teachers in my department said, we mustn't be very good at our job if we're having to plan all this intervention, which, was a bit of an awkward thing to say in a department meeting.
No, I think that's so true. There's like a few points. There's like this strand where we look at like the social emotional aspect, the kind of expectations that we set for students. If we are constantly putting them into intervention, overburdening them, we are signaling that we don't believe they can do it themselves.
Yeah.
There's also this point that like, okay, we aren't doing interventions. We are looking like proactively at supplying our students, not with specific intervention for a subject, but we are looking at an intervention that attacks the metacognitive skills and self-regulation skills so they can help themselves.
Mm.
I've done that before in schools where I put in a metacognitive program. So for across like two key stages, you can put in kind of a regular diet, either in their tutor time or if you have another kind of regulated time that you can save and protect so that you can give that regular diet of metacognitive strategies, study skills. And it can't be too broad. I think we've all put students into really broad, here's the top 10 revision tips, and you should
Yeah.
eat really well and sleep really well. You have to go much more specifically into what metacognition is and teach students how to do it for every single task within a lesson. And it is true, if we have to do intervention all the time, then the quality of our teaching and learning in the classroom, it says something there
Yeah.
that we are not depending on teachers and trusting them to do excellent work within the time that they have with those students already. And I think that could be something down to like how we train teachers and do CPD within our schools so that they are using adaptive teaching to specifically target students within that lesson, as opposed to waiting until a crisis point happens and you do some assessment that is kind of a cumulative assessment as opposed to formative. And you get this scary point where the student then has to have an intervention. So there's several things there to unpack.
Yeah, and I suppose I started with this, but if you think about that over the course of the year, let's assume that you think, right, I don't want to get mixed up with performance and learning. So these kids, if I picked them in term one, I'm going to keep them the whole year because clearly something went wrong last year. We've got to make sure it doesn't go wrong again this year. Then as the year goes on, you start identifying more and more students. Oh, we noticed this student. Okay, we'll put them in the group as well. By the end of the year, that intervention group could be as big or bigger than a class, particularly in our context, in international teaching where so many schools are worried about the bottom line. You've probably already got quite large class sizes in some settings, which then exasperates the issue. Then you've got probably more students than you have teachers, as a sort of ratio, than you'd like, than would be ideal. And then that intervention group just keeps growing and growing and growing until term 3, at the point of almost panic. There's supposed to be 30 plus kids potentially turning up for this one intervention session. I don't know. I'm not sure about the wisdom of it really in terms of when we pick students and how many students we can reasonably be said to intervene with outside of what's actually going on in lesson time.
I think that like it's an identification question, right? So you could say, well, there's a huge pressure in schools to get the kids over the hump. You want to get them over the D hump into C. Like that is the hump. So if they are at level 3, you need to bring them up to level 4. So that is where a lot of intervention is concentrated. When it should be concentrated quite evenly throughout. There's a massive difference in how you are intervening to get a kid from a 7 to a 9 or from an 8 to a 9. And we tend to ignore that, despite the fact that that matters a lot. That can mean a huge, huge difference when we are looking at moving from an A to an A star, for instance, in university applications. So we can't just target those students that we are afraid won't get over the hump. That means that we need to do something earlier and look at our curriculum pathways to make sure that we are providing options that are suitable for students so that they feel prepared to move on. So it's entangled. Identification is really, really difficult because like I said, it's priorities. We are prioritizing certain groups of students, and we should not just be beholden sometimes to teachers who say, okay, no, my entire group needs to be there. It's very serious. I call their parents. I make sure. So you have a few teachers that very much drive, or a few department heads that drive, saying all students must come to my intervention sessions.
Yeah.
And this could be at the expense of other subject learning. So there's got to be an issue of kind of subject equity and prioritization for the kids as well. If they want to study the sciences, later on, maybe they shouldn't be so beholden and punished for not attending history sessions, for instance.
And also just in terms of, you know, how they feel about themselves. Let's say they've got a tennis club after school, and when they've got that racket in their hand, they feel amazing. And that gives them a bit of momentum then going into, well, hold on, I've really nailed my forehand smash. Like, it's phenomenal. Maybe I can nail this particular aspect of geography. If I just kind of really hone in and do some of the same patterns and use some of the same rituals I learned to perfect this part of tennis, maybe I could be successful there too. And so I wonder what the cost is in that regard, because you are taking children away from probably things that they do quite well, feel quite good about, and that they might even be able to make some sort of metaphorical comparison with. You know, it might be analogous to their progress in your subject area.
I think that's so true. I talk a lot about like, oh, okay, when we look at students who excel, I'm always amazed that the students that are exceptional athletes, for instance, they also tend to be exceptional academically. And you'd think that that wouldn't be the case because they devote, especially if they're specialized, if they are a really fantastic athlete, they are elite in their sport. You wouldn't think that they would have the time
Yeah.
to give to academics, but it is that whole idea of like deliberate practice and mastery. So you understand the concepts, again, that you should be practicing often. You should be practicing smart, making these marginal and incremental gains to get better and better and better and better. And because you have that mindset that you can improve and you know the strategies to do it, and that you have to be completely active and focused in that zone in order to, I think that that mindset is incredibly powerful, so that you have students who know how to do that. It's almost like they know how to navigate school. If they know how to navigate schools, they can improve, then that's what happens. So it kind of goes back to this idea of like intervention shouldn't be subject knowledge where I'm doing a lot of kind of prior knowledge
Yeah.
and remedial work. We can use adaptive teaching like software to do a lot of that remedial work for us. They shouldn't be an intervention for that. They could be doing that independently. They are looking for something a little bit different. And I think that if you have, again, a steady diet of this is how you approach tasks, that saves you from doing, again, these interventions too late or in a way that might make a student feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, and there's something you said there as well about, you know, you wouldn't think that they have time to be exceptional athletes, and and it's almost as though time isn't the issue. It's the use of time. It's actually maximizing that time. And I think that's something that students need to be taught. And probably those students who are incredible athletes have just learned that through actually doing. They've not realized that that's something they're picking up on. But I want to go back to something you said a moment ago, because I think I'm guilty of it. And I like pointing out, I like identifying these things that I've kind of been guilty of. You sort of hinted at this idea that we're not that keen on finding the 8s to 9s and really working on those. And we're not that keen on the 7s to 8s. We really like the 3s till 4s and the 4s to 5s. And I think what I'm thinking now is that when I'm doing that identification process and I'm looking at my data, I feel really good when I find those. Oh, hold on, his Cat 4 is quite handy, actually. He's got quite a good Cat 4 score. He looks as though he's underperforming. Which areas is he underperforming? I found the area. Now I'm going to send him to this group and I'm going to send an email. Ooh. And I feel I've done something. I feel I've achieved something. Now, now he's got the low average. Oh, I'm going to take him to the average score, which is normally quite achievable. Certainly, I think most teachers feel much more confident in achieving that than, say, for example, working out what the difference between an 8 and a 9 is and finding those margins. I always remember was my NQT or RQT year. So I was asking one of might have been the head of department or the second department, how do we get them from A to A star? Oh, it's all ephemeral. It's about their flair. It's about these intangibles, these intangible things.
Yeah, it's always
Brilliant.
the paper that
Absolutely
year.
brilliant.
It's up to the paper that year. We're at the whims of the paper gods.
Yeah, and so the answer is, alas, finished. What could I possibly know about this or do about this? Well, I best just do the ones that I feel confident in. I know about 3 to 4. I know about 4 to 5, and particularly in sort of hierarchical knowledge subjects like maths, they must really, really get excited by that. It's like, oh, if they just can do this, then that's 7 points more, and that's all they need. So I wonder to what extent we're guilty of that with intervention. It's really is targeting a particular type of student who probably is quite low on confidence anyway, probably realizes that they're getting this extra attention because they, they're on the border of a failing grade. It is a bit of a strange system that sort of self-perpetuates, doesn't it?
Well, I think I have many opinions.
No way.
I have many opinions on how data is used in schools incorrectly. And I think that kind of begins with cognitive ability testing. Like Cat4 is just one example. We don't use Cat4 properly. If you go onto GL like website, you can actually see that the purpose of Cat4 is to look at an individual student, so that you can actually see any biases in the batteries between their profiles. So the way that you approach a student who has a high spatial score and a low verbal score is going to be very different. And that is what's useful, is looking at those individual batteries. And too often we just look at the standardized score, the average of those 4 batteries. And that's pretty useless. And we use that to build a picture of a cohort, for instance. I don't like using Cat4 as a single identifier. It is not as useful as looking at how that student is doing in that exact subject in that exact moment. So current attainment is the most useful piece of data that we have. As someone who teaches geography, I know that how a student does in physical geography and volcanoes, it doesn't necessarily reflect in what they are going to be doing in human geography, and they're looking at economic development. They're 2 different areas. And so I would see a student ping pong up and down depending on where they are, and I need to be reflective of that in their current attainment. At the same time, I'm not saying that Cat4 isn't a useful indicator, but I think it is a very funny one that we use it to calculate value add. I remember once a senior school leader telling me, oh, well, we are giving them their Cat4 tests on Friday, late in the day, after they have all done their 5-mile run outside,
Yeah.
because that makes for excellent value add. And it's true. I think that we're very dependent on saying like the value is how we're calculating it based on this one test. That's our value as a teacher. And I feel like that is fundamentally creating structures where we don't target kids in a great way. We're not getting specific and detailed and looking at a student, not a group, not kind of judging them and putting a ceiling on what we think or can expect of them. So when it comes to intervention, again, identification is everything, but I would put more stock in the assessments that are internal that we do at the end of year 8 to then use that to inform interventions in year 9, for instance.
Yeah.
And again, we have to trust ourselves. It means that we have rigorous data that we are collecting within our school, and we are trusting our teachers to make great decisions in how they create assessments.
And that's one of the
So
worries,
that's a
isn't
lot.
it?
That is my rant. That's probably not the first time you've heard my rant about data. But yeah, it determines so much. And if the structures are unsound, if that foundation isn't there, then we are doing everything incorrectly and we are limiting students.
Yeah, and I think that internal data, trusting that internal data is often where people, particularly with a performance management structure that relies so heavily on prediction and for outcomes, future outcomes, I think that's probably where a lot of that mistrust comes from. I feel like a mountain biker must feel at the top of like a big ridge. There's this path this way, which is our ongoing debate, argument about Cat4. And then there's what we actually said we'd talk about. And that one that direction looks really cool, but quite dangerous. And I don't think we're ever going to fully agree on it. But I essentially agree with you. But my one thing with it is I think it does measure something. But I think with any data set, it's about the extrapolation of that data, isn't it? It's about how it's used and exactly what you've just said there. When it starts being used as this thing of like, oh, we'll be able to measure an entire cohort. Okay, so you're loosening the inferences that you can make. You're actually trying to make larger and larger inferences with narrower and narrower data. And I think that's probably where schools come unstuck. It's when you can use those data sets against each other. Because I think I'm going to get this wrong and a mathematician will call me up on it, but I think the R is the reliability score. And I think that it is pretty good normally, Cat 4. It's like 0.8 as a prediction measure, which is very good for a lot of subjects. Gets looser with things like drama, as you'd expect, things like 0.4, 0.5. But it does measure something. But I think you're right. The issue is when we start saying this one number can tell us this entire profile of this student who, you know, extreme example, but last year in year 10 lost his father. Like, sorry, which one do you think is more relevant? The fact he got a 98 or the fact last year he lost his father? Because one's going to have a larger impact on his educational outcomes than the other. So I do appreciate what you're saying, but yeah, let's not go down that rocky bridge.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something really key there, is that we don't understand the inner lives of our students. But I would mention this: as much as Cat 4 like measures something, it doesn't necessarily indicate it doesn't necessarily capture everything. So one of the things that I read yesterday, it was a Forbes article, and it was looking at standardized testing. And it kind of cited a 2016 article by Tiankin, and it looked at standardized testing in the US. And what was really, really interesting is that middle school state standardized test results, actually, if you looked at family and community demographic data, that would predict your score incredibly accurately within a few degrees. So it tells you more about the socioeconomic placement of a student than it does about their academic ability, because one kind of decides the other. So there's something kind of the tail's wagging the dog there, and we need to fit something. We need to fix something a little bit larger. So if the purpose of education is to address social immobility, then we need to be doing something a little bit different than relying on TED scores, or a standardized test score that is merely reflective of a socioeconomic situation and not necessarily what they are learning every single day in the classroom.
And one of the difficulties there with the American system is that the endpoint assessment, the SATs, as most people consider that one of the key endpoint assessments, maps virtually entirely onto IQ and almost can't be prepared for. It's not necessarily a measure of what you've been doing in school. It's almost a measure of what you had in the first place. And that makes that really challenging.
SATs correlate perfectly with family income, like
as well.
perfectly. Yeah, so it's if you're a family that earns 200,000 plus, your SAT score is more likely to be 17, 12 or higher, as opposed it's almost a perfect downward graph. The less money you make as a family, the lower your SAT scores are. And that can be quite demoralizing, because if you want to go to an Ivy League university, for instance, the difference in 20 to 30 SAT marks or points is massive. I think that's why we started to see during COVID and after, there's been a movement upon, within like a lot of elite institutions like Harvard and Yale, to not rely on SATs. So it's optional to submit your SATs, and it's more holistic application approach. Dartmouth actually is really fascinating, because they had that and now they've taken and rescinded that back. And now they're saying, no, actually, we want the rigor of an SAT score. The other thing is the degree. So the graduate test, in order to get into graduate school, actually has absolutely no impact on how graduate students will actually perform in their chosen program. It's just a really fancy cognitive ability test. It's got a few tricky math questions in there, but it excludes a lot of marginalized communities, people of color, and women. So yeah, I hate these tests.
Yeah,
we can do better. I think we need good we need better systems for how we intervene with students, and that means seeing the student in front of us, not necessarily being dependent on a raw data score, or we're not, because what we're not doing is triangulating. You know, and I think that's what's important. Like Cat 4, incredibly useful. I use Cat 4 all the time. But again, it should be tempered. It should not be high stakes, and it should be triangulated with other data.
Not after a 5-mile run.
Not after a 5-mile
run. But the other thing as well, and you've sort of spoken about this before with intervention, is one of the biggest predictors for success, more than IQ, I think, in things I've read, is conscientiousness. And so if you're thinking about that as a thing, well, yeah, some of it's attached to personality, but actually you can become more conscientious. You can become more, you know, um, more organized. You can have better rituals and better systems. And as schools, shouldn't we be really good at training people on how to use systems? Like we're pretty much just a bundle of systems in a building. Yet
Yeah.
we never ever really seem to do what you've described there. I have never, maybe this is my naivety, I've never come across a school that says, we're actually just going to work on your habits and you're going to bring some information from your subject leader that you're struggling in. But that is really just the vehicle to master these new things. We're going to teach you about how to revise knowledge or how to, look at a rubric and work out whether you're doing it, but also to set time aside and actually be organized and actually do the things you say you're going to do and hold yourself to account. We should be fantastic at teaching children those things. And yet I don't know many institutions that even try it.
I think it's really interesting because, like, again, I've spent a lot of time looking at gifted and talented research. Again, do not believe in gifted and talented. But one of the ways that gifted and talented have typically been identified, Renzulli and Reese use a triad model. So they look at kind of ability, and they would use a cognitive ability test. I would use current attainment. They would use creative productivity, which is kind of like curiosity, so intellectual curiosity, but then the ability to actually create a product. So that kid who says, like, Mr. Brennan, I have written my own collection of short stories outside of school that I love and I really want you to read over. So those kids that want to create something that shows that they love that subject, they want to go beyond the current curriculum. And then the third component would what would be called kind of dispositional traits. So you are born with more intrinsic motivation, and you know how to self-regulate and study. And I think, again, all three of those things are things that can be sparked and taught.
Mm.
So if you are passionate and you give extension opportunities within a subject, you can actually create opportunities for creative productivity. And when we take a look at those dispositional traits, you are not born having work ethic. I think that there is something there that we need to teach those habits. I think that it's Aristotle who said that. It's not like it's a new idea that habits form behavior. At Renzulli and Reese's triad, they actually put gifted behaviors at the very center of that, with the idea that that's what we're trying to build. We are not trying to make students excel in one particular area by drilling them over and over in past paper questions. The entire idea is that we give them the habits, so no matter what they encounter, they can be successful. I think that's really key. So if you're looking at three areas, that's a really useful tool to kind of see where students have potential. And you can say, I can spark them in this way, I can give them a skill or help them practice it here, here, here.
Interesting. I started the conversation wanting you to say, right, 5 students from grade 7 or year 7 in term 1, and then move up to 10 students for your intervention in term 2, and then end with 15, and then everything will be 15% better, and that's brilliant. And we've ended up all over the map. We've actually got to different approaches to it and different ways of identifying, which is really useful. And I think that's probably, a much better approach. And I wonder sometimes in education if we're maybe a little institutionalized here and we're just used to, okay, yeah, there's the wave 1 thing, the wave 2 thing, then we grab the students, then we email the parents, then we do the thing. And actually what you've suggested really is a total flipping of the entire model and saying, right, well, what's the actual problem that we're trying to solve here? It can't just be that this one student is just not performing in all these subjects and the problem is just some sort of ability, or the problem is, not enough hours in the day, or the teaching it. Well, what's actually underneath this? What could we actually solve that would address these 5 areas rather than just thinking about the subject specialist issues? I think we've also touched on as well the issue of identifying, because it makes teachers feel good, which I think is a big problem. Is there anything that we said at the start we would cover that we haven't? I'm not sure.
Well, we've gone off on some wonderful tangents.
We always do. That's okay though.
I think it's really I think it's really interesting. I think that imagine if you just randomly selected 5, 10, 15 students for intervention, and then
Mm.
just see what happens. Or let's look at let's see if we can get students to volunteer to take an enrichment program where they just look at metacognition, And I think that would be fascinating. I think it would be really cool to see, well, if we randomly select students and we have flexible groupings, I wonder how much, just through osmosis,
Yeah.
students would latch on to those behaviors, and it's learning those habits and behaviors, so that intervention sessions don't become so much you as a teacher digesting things and then kind of putting all of those like little morsels into the baby birds' mouths for them, but instead they're learning to fly and
Well,
get the
because
worms for themselves.
yeah, because if someone was going to explain the socioeconomic thing, the correlation you spoke about earlier, they'd be like, oh, it's just because those households, it's all just academic all the time. It's osmosis. They're just picking it up. That would be that like one of the available explanations for that. And yet nobody then goes, aha, well, we'll use that approach at school. We'll start having lunchtime that's really academic, and we'll have conversations about the latest debates, and we'll invite them to do lots of opportunities outside of school. It's just like, cancel all the opportunities and just drill on the knowledge until the kid gets better.
It's, to be
I-
honest, coming from a Canadian system, like the British system is very funny, and I think
Hey,
the American system too. It's very much like we have standardized tests. We have to show our value as teachers,
yeah,
and so and the blame actually goes to teachers. You're not teaching well enough. The blame goes to students. You're not smart enough.
yes.
We've done some ability testing. You're not smart enough to begin with. So the blame goes in those two directions. It becomes a race to the bottom, or we're incentivizing the wrong things. And that's really frustrating. We shouldn't be looking at blaming students or teachers. We should be looking at fixing systems. And instead, we keep testing more to say, oh, we're making the systems more rigorous.
Yeah.
No, your testing is actually driving us to the bottom, and it's taking some of the joy and curiosity, and kind of the optimistic mindset out of education. It's incentivizing all the wrong things. So interventions, again, great. Let's plan some interventions if test scores for getting kids over the CD hump are what really, really matter. We can be more thoughtful in our approaches, more holistic, more triangulated in our identification. So yeah, there's a lot there.
But the
I
other,
think if we pick
just as you were
anything,
talking through
we'll
that,
untangle it.
just as you were talking
Sorry.
through that as well, I realized that with intervention, at the end of it, whether it's been successful or not, if it's been successful, we tend to praise the intervention. Oh, we did intervention with that kid. That's how he's done so well. And if no improvement is made, we go, ah, he's a pickle, isn't he? So, so the intervention
He's a
has worked.
pickle.
No matter what's happened, the intervention's worked. The intervention wasn't the problem. Nobody then goes, oh, we did that intervention, and actually none of them made any progress, or only 4 of the 15 made progress. Do you think that intervention was actually worth doing? Will we do that again next year? They just do it again the next year. Um, and the blame if it doesn't work is with the child, and the success is with the teacher. It's a perfect system.
And I think in a lot of places, like we've created a system now. I always thought it was so funny. My current school, for the very first time, I got KPIs. And
Mm,
I'm familiar with KPIs in the sense of like I'm a salesman, like in a business meeting talking about
yeah,
my KPIs, not students.
yeah,
It didn't occur to me, but there is, and again, in some places we do see that meeting these KPIs actually has a huge impact on teacher pay, for instance.
yeah,
And when we look at cases where teachers are actually helping students, when they shouldn't be helping them, when you're trying to get an idea, a good of their current attainment, I find that both hilarious and awful.
yeah.
That we don't want to use real data to begin with, and we are incentivizing teachers or punishing them. Again, incentives are all wrong, and we've actually created a system where we might get unreliable data, which doesn't help anyone, which
Yeah.
is why lots of like lovely, gorgeous, formative assessment for learning is the most impactful thing that we can do. So removing all of these high stakes assessments that create a need to drive interventions in the first place. When we take those away, we create a more inclusive and better learning environment, and hopefully more impactful um, more impactful learning and kind of the keys to lifelong learning for students.
Yeah, it's amazing actually that we even have to distinguish between those two things. Sometimes when I'm talking to people outside of education, they find a lot of it quite hilarious. So KPIs would be a good example of that. They find it hilarious that KPIs don't result in you increasing your pay. And when I said like, oh, you know, try to explain as you just have, they just sort of look at you and they're just very confused. They don't really understand that. And so they kind of have this idea that a KPI is just this thing that, in fact, to the extent that they said they wouldn't bother with it if it didn't increase their pay. They have this idea that it's so tied to achievement that that what else could it be? Of course, it has to be that. Then the other thing, what did you just finish saying? Then it just triggered something that I'd been talking to someone about. You were talking about the. Oh God, it's gone. Oh, it's gone. I should have
I
said that
talk a lot,
first.
Todd. I talk a lot.
You do. It's always good stuff. No, there was something else there about that people had identified in industry as an issue with education, and it's totally gone from my brain. Sorry. If you can remember what you just said, it might trigger what I.
Sorry, it's all a blur. My rants are all a blur.
It was something to do with performance and education. Maybe that's a good point to wrap it up, because I don't think it's going to come back to me. But
I think we've covered so much. I think that like I'd like all our conversations, they tend to meander around us.
we're
Yeah,
rubbish. Okay, just remembered what it was. So essentially, when you were saying there about formative and summative assessment, something I've thought probably since very early in my career was about how ridiculous that we even have that distinction. That, you know, in the
yeah.
UK system, you can't easily call your papers back. You can't say, okay, AQA, we really want all our papers back with the comments. We want to kind of work out what's going on. I gave this assembly about 2 years ago, maybe just after COVID had finished. The boys at my school at the time were really interested in MMA. It was around the time of the Conor and Khabib fight, and I was sort of using McGregor as a bad example of what it is to be a good character, a good sportsman, etc. But then I pointed out he does something really interesting at the end of the fight. He's just been humiliated, really, in front of the world, and he looks up and he watches why he's just been humiliated in the world, and he's transfixed until there's a fight that kicks off after the fight. But he's literally trying to unpick, why did that just happen? What could I have done about it? As there's not much admirable about the way this man has approached this event, but that's interesting. And we spoke very briefly about how every assessment should be that. Every single assessment should be going, okay, why didn't I do what I think I can do? Why didn't I get the result or the outcome that I wanted? What am I not currently able to do in this topic? And yet we have this idea of, is this formative? Is this summative? Is this high stakes? Is this low stakes? In what terms? Like, to some anxious kid, every assessment is high stakes, you know. Equally
I think
to
it's really interesting.
adapted kid.
I I think I love that just because there's something about like there is something there. Like that is what experts do as they look back. But what I think is really funny is that you think that kids hate tests, and that's just simply not true. Kids love tests. They love it because they want to know exactly how they're doing. There's a reason that as soon as you deliver a test, they want to know how soon you will mark it and get it back to them. And there's something specific about the feedback. They enjoy it. Because they do want to know how to improve. I think we all do. It's part of this human drive that we have to know more, to do better. And if they are anxious, if there's something in us that is making it too high stakes, and we need to constantly assess so that it becomes like low stakes, you know? I think one of the reasons that GCSEs, A-level exams are so hard and bring about so much stress, why end of year exams in year 7 seems so daunting, is because we are saying this is the end of the year. This goes on your final report. Your parents are going to read it. The universities look at this. You have to put your GCSEs on your resumes until you're 60. Like,
Yeah. Your
there's something
grandmother
there.
will judge you.
We make it so high stakes. But I think as a whole, like kids love tests.
Yeah.
They do love tests. Like, and the way that we can gamify that, the way that we make it fun, the way that we give feedback, there's something really incredible that we can do with assessment. So I think assessment should probably be maybe our next topic that we
I was just
discuss
going to
because
say,
there is so much there.
so homework, not as a topic, but homework for next week. We both need to come back with a clear idea of what intervention should be. and I'm going to say
Okay.
advice for someone launching intervention based on what we spoke about last time. What should people be doing from Monday morning? And then we'll go into assessment. I think that's a really good way of doing it, particularly
Yeah,
that
okay,
informative.
let's
How to
read
make.
our Dylan William and yeah, and then we'll get going. That sounds great.
I'm only going to read Christodoulou. I'm all in on Christodoulou,
All day, Daisy.
even though I've got no confidence in saying her name. I think I'm getting it right.
That's okay. That's okay.
Right. So that's
Okay, that
homework for
sounds
next time. We'll
great.
start with that. What have we agreed intervention should be or not agreed? And then into assessment.
We'll never agree on anything, Todd. That's what makes this fun. Thank you
Right.
so much.
Always fun. Speak to you soon, mate. Bye bye.
Bye.